Walter Reed's mornings were a quiet ritual marked by the steady hum of Grand Steiner's diner and the soft clinking of silverware against plates. Each Sunday he arrived early, his snow-white hair slightly tousled under the weight of years, wearing a worn brown coat and jeans frayed at the cuffs. He moved with care, steadying himself on a cane, his prosthetic leg making a faint creak with each measured step. The air was filled with the comforting scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the low murmur of old country tunes slipping from a dusty speaker in the corner. He chose his usual seat near the back by the exit, a spot unnoticed by most, but familiar to him. Walter's eyes, steady yet distant, rarely met those around him. His hands gripped the glass of water with quiet determination, fingers wrapped as if holding on to more than just the cold condensation. On his left wrist rested a faded tattoo, a dagger crossed through an anchor, barely visible beneath time's erosion. It was a mark of brotherhood, of battles fought silently in shadows few would understand. Though Walter wore no medals, carried no cap embroidered with unit insignias, and spoke no words beyond ordering the veteran special scrambled eggs and toast, the weight of his presence was unmistakable to those who knew how to see. Yet to many others he was just a thin, quiet man, invisible amidst the Sunday crowd of retirees, churchgoers, and regulars exchanging war stories. Some real, some exaggerated. The atmosphere shifted subtly as a group of men at the center table noticed the tattoo. Whispers turned to smirks, smirks to chuckles. "Probably drew that himself," one muttered. "No vet eats alone without a badge," said another, their laughter quiet but sharp, slicing through the diner's warmth. Walter's gaze remained fixed on his glass, unblinking lips pressed tight. A heaviness settled around him, neither shame nor sorrow, but something far deeper, a silent endurance. As the manager approached, clipboard in hand, his customer service smile felt like a mask rather than kindness. "Sir," he said softly but firmly, "we've had some complaints. Would you mind moving to the patio seating?" The room didn't hush, but the air thickened with tension. Walter nodded, not in agreement, but in weary acceptance, gathering his tray with deliberate care. Each slow step outside was a negotiation between pride and pain. His prosthetic leg creaked beneath frayed jeans as he passed the center table, where laughter now simmered with spite. A final, cruel toast. "If he's a seal, I must be the president," echoed before the silence swallowed the moment. And then as a single tear traced a lonely path down his weathered cheek and dropped onto the cold tile, Walter stepped into the chill of late autumn light, carrying with him a dignity both fragile and unyielding. Outside the wind bit sharply, but Walter settled at a corner table, hands gripping his cane, and plate the steam from cold eggs rising slowly in the crisp air. The diner resumed its artificial comfort behind him, but the weight of that quiet morning lingered, a solemn reminder of sacrifices unseen, stories untold, and the silent heroes who walk among us, carrying their past in faded ink and quiet grace. As the wind whispered through the empty streets, the diner's door jingled again, and a new presence stepped inside, one that would change everything. Walter Reed's forced move to the patio left a heavy silence lingering inside Grant's diner. The warmth of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee felt distant, replaced by a coldness that wasn't just from the autumn air outside. Walter sat alone at the edge of the patio, hunched over his plate of eggs, untouched now, his grip tight around his cane. Around him the world carried on, laughter, chatter, clinking dishes, but none of it reached him. He was a solitary figure, a quiet monument to battles only he remembered. Inside, the regulars barely noticed his absence. The center table of men who had earlier mocked him continued their conversation with a careless edge. Their golf jackets, bright against the worn booths, seemed to carry an invisible shield against empathy. "Maybe he should have stayed outside," one whispered, a smirk playing at his lips. Others nodded in agreement, their eyes darting toward the patio window, without truly seeing the man they excluded. The waitress, a young girl still new to the rhythms of the diner, watched Walter through the glass. Her heart clenched at the sight of his bowed shoulders and the way the cold mist rose around his silent figure. She remembered the tattoo, the dagger and anchor, an emblem she had never understood, but felt carried weight far beyond ink and skin. She felt helpless, caught between the rules she'd been taught and the compassion stirring inside her. Outside, the wind tugged at Walter's coat, scattering leaves across the cracked pavement. His prosthetic leg rested firmly beneath the table, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth he'd lost inside. The world seemed indifferent to his pain, the mocking voices fading but replaced by a heavier silence. His eyes, once steady, flickered with memories of camaraderie, of brotherhood, of a time when every moment held meaning beyond what others could see. Then, just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind gray clouds, the diner's bell jingled sharply, cutting through the quiet. Heads turned as a young man entered, sharp-cut, hair-crisp black jacket and a presence that commanded respect without a word. His gaze swept the room, stopping cold when it landed on the empty chair where Walter had been. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The laughter died. Conversations faltered and all eyes fixed on the newcomer. He moved deliberately toward the patio window, eyes narrowing as they locked onto the tattoo still visible on Walter's wrist through the glass. This was no ordinary soldier. There was recognition, a bond forged in silent understanding and shared sacrifice. The men who had mocked before now shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the gravity of what they'd dismissed. Outside, Walter's hand tightened around the cane as the door opened again. The young soldier stepped out onto the patio, the cold air contrasting with the fire in his eyes. Without hesitation, he stood tall before Walter, raising a hand in a crisp, respectful salute. The simple gesture spoke volumes, an acknowledgement of a life lived in service, a brotherhood that transcended years and distance. Walter looked up slowly, his weary eyes meeting those of the young man. For a moment, the weight of loneliness lifted, replaced by a quiet strength that only true recognition can bring. The streetlights flickered on nearby as the two men, separated by generations but united by honor, faced each other, a silent promise passing between them that this moment would change everything. Inside the diner, a hush fell over the crowd. The story that had been hidden in silence was about to be told. Walter Reed's solitude was broken when the young soldier, Jackson Miles, stood before him, his salute crisp and unwavering. Inside the diner, a hush fell like a heavy curtain, the usual clatter of cups and conversation replaced by the weight of unspoken respect. The tattoo on Walter's wrist, the faded dagger crossed through an anchor, was no ordinary mark. It was a symbol known only to a few, whispered about in the darkest corners of Navy SEAL training camps, a badge of brotherhood and sacrifice few could understand. Jackson's voice was steady but carried a quiet reverence as he spoke. "Sir, are you Walter Reed of SEAL Team Bravo?" The words hung in the cold autumn air, carrying decades of untold stories. Walter's eyes met Jackson's, surprised, hesitant, but there was recognition flickering beneath his weathered gaze. The name G7 slipped from Jackson's lips, the code designation that had become legend among the few who knew. For years, Walter had carried the weight of silence. The clandestine missions, the lives saved under fire without fanfare, the brotherhood sealed in shadows. Jackson's presence brought those memories rushing back, not as ghosts, but as living testament to a life devoted to duty. The young SEAL did not lower his salute, waiting patiently for permission to sit, an unspoken acknowledgement of respect for a man who had shaped the very protocols they still followed. The diners inside watched in stunned silence, the earlier mockery fading into shame. The four men who had laughed before now sat, rigid eyes downcast, the weight of their ignorance pressing heavily on their shoulders. Jackson's firm voice cut through the tension. "If anyone here feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend, maybe you should be the ones eating outside." A silence deeper than any before settled, the message clear and undeniable. Then a quiet moment of connection. The waitress stepped forward, pulling from her apron a folded photograph, an image of two young men in jungle gear, grinning beneath the dense canopy of a distant war. One was her grandfather, James Harrington, whose stories had filled her childhood with whispered awe. The other bore the tattoo, a symbol now radiant with meaning. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for the photo, his eyes tracing the familiar faces frozen in time. The decades of silence cracked just slightly, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, soft, elusive, but genuine. Jackson watched, reverent, knowing this moment transcended words. It was an unspoken vow that the past would not be forgotten, that the sacrifices made in shadows would be brought into the light. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it the promise of change. Inside the diner, respect had replaced scorn, and a community began to awaken to the quiet hero among them. This was not just an honor for Walter Reed, it was a reckoning, a restoration of dignity long denied. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the patio, the story of silent service found its voice, and the town's heart began to beat anew. Walter Reed's solitude was broken when the young soldier, Jackson Miles, stood before him, his salute crisp and unwavering. Inside the diner, a hush fell like a heavy curtain, the usual clatter of cups and conversation replaced by the weight of unspoken respect. The tattoo on Walter's wrist, the faded dagger crossed through an anchor, was no ordinary mark. It was a symbol known only to a few, whispered about in the darkest corners of Navy SEAL training camps, a badge of brotherhood and sacrifice few could understand. Jackson's voice was steady but carried a quiet reverence as he spoke. "Sir, are you Walter Reed of SEAL Team Bravo?" The words hung in the cold autumn air, carrying decades of untold stories. Walter's eyes met Jackson's, surprised, hesitant, but there was recognition flickering beneath his weathered gaze. The name G7 slipped from Jackson's lips, the code designation that had become legend among the few who knew. For years, Walter had carried the weight of silence. The clandestine missions, the lives saved under fire, without fanfare, the brotherhood sealed in shadows. Jackson's presence brought those memories rushing back, not as ghosts, but as living testament to a life devoted to duty. The young SEAL did not lower his salute, waiting patiently for permission to sit in unspoken acknowledgement of respect for a man who had shaped the very protocols they still followed. The diners inside watched in stunned silence, their earlier mockery fading into shame. The four men who had laughed before now sat rigid, eyes downcast, the weight of their ignorance pressing heavily on their shoulders. Jackson's firm voice cut through the tension. "If anyone here feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend, maybe you should be the ones eating outside." A silence deeper than any before settled the message, clear and undeniable. Then a quiet moment of connection. The waitress stepped forward, pulling from her apron a folded photograph, an image of two young men in jungle gear, grinning beneath the dense canopy of a distant war. One was her grandfather, James Harrington, whose stories had filled her childhood with whispered awe. The other bore the tattoo, a symbol now radiant with meaning. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for the photo, his eyes tracing the familiar faces frozen in time. The decades of silence cracked just slightly, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, soft, elusive, but genuine. Jackson watched, reverent, knowing this moment transcended words. It was an unspoken vow that the past would not be forgotten, that the sacrifices made in shadows would be brought into the light. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it the promise of change. Inside the diner, respect had replaced scorn, and a community began to awaken to the quiet hero among them. This was not just an honor for Walter Reed, it was a reckoning, a restoration of dignity long denied. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the patio, the story of silent service found its voice, and the town's heart began to beat anew. Walter Reed sat quietly, the worn photograph resting gently in his hands, its edges soft from years of handling. The air between him, Jackson, and the young waitress was thick with unspoken memories, the weight of years folding into this small sunlit patio at the edge of Grand Steiner. Outside, a cool breeze stirred fallen leaves, while inside the diner the hum of conversations returned, but something fundamental had shifted. The moment was fragile, sacred. Jackson lowered his gaze respectfully, his salute still fresh in the air, as he pulled out his phone and snapped a photograph capturing Walter, the faded dagger and anchor tattoo, the folded photo, and the quiet solidarity surrounding them. It was a simple image, but one charged with meaning, a bridge between past and present sacrifice and remembrance. By nightfall, that photograph had begun its journey beyond the town's borders, carried swiftly by the relentless currents of social media. Millions of eyes would soon witness the quiet dignity of a man who never sought fame, whose service had been etched not in medals but in silence. Comments flooded in, some moved to tears, others confessing surprise that such a hero had lived unnoticed for so long. The hashtag #ChungSilentService began to take hold, weaving a new narrative for Walter Reed and for those like him. The next morning brought a fresh wave of attention. Local news teams arrived at Grant's Diner, cameras poised to capture the story that had been waiting decades to be told. The manager, who had once asked Walter to sit outside, now found himself evasive, impale dodging questions about the treatment of veterans. Meanwhile, the waitress spoke openly, recounting the loneliness she had witnessed, the invisible burdens carried by a man who had never asked for anything but respect. Letters arrived by the dozens, handwritten notes from veterans who recognized the significance of the tattoo, from school children who drew pictures of Walter as a smiling old man with a steadfast heart. Each envelope was a thread weaving the fabric of a community awakening to its forgotten history. Walter himself seemed unsure at first, holding the letters, carefully unsure how to respond to the tide of appreciation washing over him. But slowly a renewed purpose began to take root. Invitations came for Walter to speak at churches, schools, and community gatherings, not to boast, but to share the quiet lessons of endurance and sacrifice. His modest auto shop, once overlooked, began to see a steady stream of neighbors and veterans, seeking not just repairs but connection. And then came the proposal from City Hall, a motion to rename the street where Walter's shop stood. Silent Service Way, a simple name etched in steel and humility, honoring the quiet men and women whose sacrifices are often unseen. The unveiling was understated, no ribbons, no speeches, just a small American flag planted beneath the new sign. Walter stood beside it, eyes glistening but steady, his weathered hand resting lightly on the plaque. It was a quiet victory, a restoration not just of a name, but of dignity long denied. In the weeks that followed, Walter shared fragments of his story with those who asked, tales of missions under fire, of comrades lost and promises kept, told not as heroics, but as the work of a man finishing what he'd begun. His smile, rare but genuine, was a testament to a life lived with honor beyond recognition. As the town embraced its silent hero, a new chapter was just beginning, one where stories once buried in shadows would shine with the light of remembrance. Walter Reed's quiet life found new meaning as the town began to embrace him, not just as a veteran, but as a symbol of the sacrifices carried silently by so many. Letters and drawings filled the diner's bulletin board, each a testament to the lives he had touched without ever seeking recognition. Children brought their colorful artwork, veterans shared stories that echoed his own, and neighbors stopped by the modest auto shop, not just for repairs, but for conversation, eager to learn from the man who had carried so much without complaint. The air around Walter shifted from one of isolation to gentle camaraderie. Volunteers from the local high school appeared one morning, armed with paint buckets and ladders, ready to refresh the weathered exterior of his shop. Walter grumbled softly, unused to such attention, but allowed them in. The squeaky gate was fixed, the roof patched, and tools donated by veterans arrived without fanfare. He accepted their help with a quiet nod, returning to work with steady hands and a heart unburdened by silence. Then came the city's formal recognition. On a brisk spring morning, Walter stood beside the unveiling of a plaque at City Hall, a simple marker honoring the quiet ones, those who bore invisible burdens so others might live free. The dagger and anchor tattoo was etched into the steel, a symbol immortalized for all to see. Walter's eyes shimmered with moisture, but no tears fell. The moment spoke volumes without a single word. Walter's 85th birthday arrived quietly as he had wished, with black coffee and toast. But that morning the stillness was broken by the arrival of 7 young men in polished Navy uniforms, flanked by black SUVs and Humvees. Among them was Sarah Harrington, granddaughter of the waitress's grandfather, carrying a folded American flag and a small wooden box. Walter's brow furrowed in confusion until he recognized the faces before him, the legacy they represented. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, reminding Walter of promises kept across generations. The box held a medallion from the Navy SEAL Historical Foundation, engraved with Walter's name designation and the words "for service" above silence. The presentation was solemn, free from ceremony or spectacle, yet filled with profound respect. Walter accepted the medallion with whispered gratitude, his hands steady despite the weight of emotions beneath. The young SEALs stood silently behind Sarah, their immaculate uniforms, a stark contrast to the quiet humility of the man they honored. The wind rustled the leaves overhead as if nature itself paused to witness the passing of a torch. In that moment, Walter was no longer alone. The burden he had carried in silence was shared, honored, and understood. The community, once indifferent, had become a family bound by respect and remembrance. The road outside his shop was renamed Silent Service Way, a quiet tribute to a man who never sought glory but earned it nonetheless. As the sun set over Grand Steiner, Walter's legacy was no longer a whispered secret, but a beacon guiding others to remember the heroes who walk among us, unseen but never forgotten. Walter Reed's days slowed, but his spirit remained steady as the years gently folded into one another. The auto shop, where he had quietly worked for decades, became a gathering place, a sanctuary for neighbors, veterans, and curious children who sought stories rather than repairs. His voice, once reserved, softened with the sharing of memories, the narrow escapes under heavy fire, the weight of promises made in the jungle, and the silent courage that carried him through. The town of Grand Steiner carried Walter's legacy with quiet reverence. Silent Service Way stood as a daily reminder of sacrifice unseen. Its simple metal sign a beacon of respect for all who passed. The small brass plaque at Grant's Diner's corner table kept his memory alive, reading reserved in memory of Walter Reed's SEAL Team, Bravo G7. Some men carry the mission long after the war ends. When the crisp morning arrived in late September, the flags at City Hall hung at half-staff. Walter Reed had passed in his sleep peacefully, quietly, just as he had lived. The town paused. The diner closed early. The high school canceled classes. A hush settled over Grand Steiner that spoke of loss and profound gratitude. The funeral was simple, dignified. A wooden casket draped in the American flag rested beneath a leaning white steeple, its paint peeling but its spirit steadfast. Friends, family, and veterans gathered, boots, dress, uniforms, baseball caps, and choir robes, blending into a tapestry of respect. 6 active duty SEALs, including Jackson Miles, carried the casket with reverence flown in from across the country. Sarah Harrington, clutching the faded photograph of Walter and her grandfather, laid it gently upon the polished wood. No eulogies were spoken, no grand speeches delivered, only one song played slowly, its somber notes filling the chapel. The simplicity carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice. Beneath Walter's name on the headstone, the town inscribed a single line that needed no explanation. His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives. The corner table in Grant's Diner remained empty every Sunday, a quiet memorial to the man who once sat there unnoticed. Tourists who asked about Walter were met with warm smiles and pointed toward Silent Service Way. In Grand Steiner, stories weren't shouted, they were carried one quiet act at a time until the whole town remembered. And perhaps beyond the town's borders, the world remembered too. Because in the darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that for today, someone isn't forgotten. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life forever.